I'm here, and it's Friday, Geeks, and you are watching another edition of the Friday Night Geek Show. I am Dante D, and welcome to the channel where we talk about comic books and other geek stuff. I am again flying solo this evening, but that's okay because on these nights when I just do the show by myself, I actually feel like I get to engage with you, the viewers, a little bit more, so I very much look forward to doing that this evening. And this evening we have an exciting show lined up for you. We did a recap pretty much of the history of comics starting in the Golden Age in our last episode that we did. This is going to be a continuation of that, episode 2, wherein we're going to talk about the history of comics from the Silver Age on. Maybe we'll get to the Bronze Age. I don't know. Last time, I actually thought we were going to get through the entire history of comics in one hour episode, and boy, was I wrong. That was a little bit too optimistic, if you ask me, because I barely just got through the Golden Age. But that's okay, because you, the viewers, have been talking and providing comments and creating great conversations. That is exactly what I would like to do on these live streams. So keep those comments coming. At this time, I just want to take a little moment to welcome Lowell Lucas Jr., who was the first one here. It was a little early. Thank you for being early, and welcome to the show. It's always great to have you. And I see there are a few people that are just rolling in, so send me a comment. Let me know that you are here. So before we get to the actual Silver Age, I just kind of want to do a quick recap of the Golden Age, and I do mean quick. So last time we talked about the origin of superheroes and the integral role that superheroes played in keeping morale really strong during the war, and everything that the superhero community did for the war effort was just absolutely astounding. Then once the war ended, you found superheroes slowly become irrelevant. Because after that, people really didn't need heroes anymore. The war was won, and people were then looking to other genres to get their comic book fix. Genres like horror. Horror became very became very popular. Teen dramas, romances, crime comics, so many. And this is the era as well where EC Comics became very popular with their horror comics. Well, the horror comics, unfortunately, got the attention of many people in the community who were against this type of content because they felt it was poisoning the minds of youth in America at the time. And the comic book history took a huge hit. Sorry, the comic book industry took a huge hit and was just almost utterly destroyed by Frederick Wertham's seduction of the innocent. Just want to take a few moments to welcome a few other people here. Timothy Whitfield, welcome. And yeah, that's it. I think it was just Timothy Whitfield. And I saw you really enjoyed the 90s comic video. Thank you very much for watching it. I really had a lot of fun doing that video. It was so much fun. I love 90s comics, and I can't wait till we get to talking about 90s comics on this show, because I think that will be a great episode. And yes, Timothy, I also love classic horror. One of my favorite genres. EC Comics, I feel, are some of the best comic books ever published in American history. And here's Eric Breen. What, am I invisible? Nope, not anymore, because you finally sent your comment to make yourself announced, right? And hopefully, I know last week we had a few issues with the feed kind of glitching a little bit, so I really hope that is not the case this week. So let me know if you're experiencing any issues whatsoever. So we left off at horror comics and Frederick Wertham and seduction of the innocent and everything that happened, all the fallout from that. So basically, all the comic book publishers took a huge hit, and they didn't really know what to do because they were censored, 100% censored, and it was really difficult to do stories. Creativity was really lacking during this time, and the stories became very lackluster and boring. So publishers just didn't really know what to publish anymore. And Marvel during this time, at this point, had not even become a relevant comic book company. And they were just kind of playing follow the leader. They were publishing these really kind of not so great. They were kind of like B class type horror stories that were not as great as the EC stories whatsoever. But it was during this time that we were starting to see some of those horror comics be released from Marvel that eventually gave us some of our beloved characters that we love today. Titles such as Tales of Suspense, Strange Tales, Amazing Fantasy. Like, these were all books that were intended to be light horror books, because at the time, after the horror craze was slowly dying out because of all the censorship, publishers didn't know what to do, so they were still kind of publishing these horror tales that were almost in disguise, but they ended up being morality tales that were really not holding the audience's attention. Let's see here, Eric, I think it was StreamYard or YouTube problem. Yeah, I think so too, because some people were having the issue with the stream last week, and some people were not. Lowell Lucas Jr. saying it was creative how DC and Marvel worked around issues. Morbius couldn't even suck your blood traditionally. Yeah, exactly. And we'll get to that once we get to discussing the Bronze Age. So towards the end of the 1950s, the publishers now don't really know what to do. Sales are down. Comic books are pretty much hated. And creativity is pretty much out the window. And I really don't blame the publishers, because at this time they really didn't know what to do. They were essentially muzzled by mainstream America, and their creativity was very, very it was limited, really. So what happened? Well, they decided to bring back some classic characters. Stuck with nothing to publish, they were like, well, the worst that can happen is we keep selling poorly like we are now. So a very, very, very intelligent man, and probably one of the best publishers of a comic book company ever, named Julius Schwartz, who was the publisher of DC at the time, came up with the idea to bring back some of those superheroes. And I think this is really interesting, because Frederick Wertham unintentionally almost started with his book Seduction of the Innocent. I kind of feel like he was indirectly responsible for the superhero revival, which pretty much put comics mainstream again and made comics relevant again and explode in popularity. So Julius Schwartz can't do these horror tales anymore, can't do what everyone else is doing. So he decides, you know what, let's bring back the Flash. And that's exactly what they did in 1958 in Showcase number 4. They brought back the Flash, and boy, when they saw the sales figures, they knew that they were on to something again. Lowell Lucas Jr. saying, DC resorted to giant apes and gorillas. Marvel used dinosaurs. Morality tales. So as Jesse Lynch, welcome Jesse, saying morality tales. So as a kid, if you didn't do bad things, the monsters would get you. Exactly. These stories, I don't know if any of you have read any of them, but they weren't the greatest. They were quite boring, really. Stan Lee, even at the time, was saying he would just pretty much make up a sound, and that would be the name of the monster for the week that he would be writing about. He said it was just such a horrible time to be writing in comic books. So Showcase number 4 launches, and we just have huge popularity with the Flash. So what happens? The publishers decide, DC decides to bring back some other heroes as well. And in Showcase, I believe it was 20 and 22, they bring back Green Lantern. And slowly, all of these classic heroes start becoming relevant again, which is unbelievable. Because up until this point, the only heroes that remained that were still in publication really were Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. They were the only ones with sales great enough to pull them through the late 1940s and the 1950s. But heck, the Batman book even was threatened with cancellation on a few occasions just because they weren't doing that well either. Marvel, though, decides they're going to have to step up their game if they're going to stay relevant. And what do they do, essentially? Well, Stan Lee, again, was tired of doing all of these really boring morality tales that no one was really interested in. So he was actually ready to quit. He was ready to throw in the towel and say, I'm done with comic books. I need to move on to the next best thing, because this was a destitute time in comic books. Like, you did not want to be a comic book publisher at this time. Comic books were hated. Comic book writers were considered like really, really low class. It just was not a great industry to be in. Well, Stan Lee's wife, Joan, said to him, well, before you quit, I think what you need to do is do a book the way you want to. Don't do a book like the way the publishers are telling you to do it. Do it the way you want to. Like, if you're out the window anyway, the worst that can happen is they get mad and they fire you. Well, who cares? You're on your way out anyway. So he decided to do that because for a long time, Stan Lee wanted to do these more intelligent characters, these more intelligent heroes. And he was always denied. And he was always rejected by his publisher at the time, Martin Goodman, who would say, Stan, I don't really think you know what a hero is. And I think you're overestimating the intelligence of our readers, because all we have reading our books are children and a few illiterate adults. Well, Stan pretty much proved him wrong at this time by showing him some of the sales of his books and some of the sales that his characters were bringing in. Who are these characters that I'm talking about? Of course, we are talking about the Fantastic Four. Firstly, it's the Fantastic Four. And the Fantastic Four is the book that pretty much launched the Marvel Age of Comics. Showcase number 4 was the book that launched the Silver Age of Comics. So that is confirmed and agreed upon by all comic historians all over the world. But it was Fantastic Four number 1 that really launched the Marvel Age of comic books and launched the whole Marvel universe. Just want to get some comments here. We're hearing here. Let's see. Glad Stan Lee's wife was a great support to him. Such a superstar. I totally agree. Essentially, if it weren't for her, we probably would never have the heroes and the characters that we have today. It's unbelievable that a woman like that just spoke to her husband and got him to create all of these amazing characters. So Fantastic Four was also kind of published in response to what DC was doing at the time. That was the Justice League. Justice League was selling quite well in the early 1960s. Actually, according to legend, the Martin Goodman actually golfed with the editor of DC at the time, Julie Schwartz, and Julie basically told Martin, you know what, I think you need to do a book about a team of superheroes, because I think that's what's really selling. So he went back to Stan Lee and said, give me a book about a team of superheroes, because that's apparently what is selling. And yeah, it sold very, very well. So well that Stan Lee ended up creating so many other characters. His next success was Spider-Man, who first appeared in Amazing Fantasy 15. And Amazing Fantasy 15 was a failed science fiction magazine. Spider-Man actually first appeared in the last issue of Amazing Fantasy 15. It was going to be canceled after. So after this book was released, the sales figures were great. They brought the sales figures to Stan Lee brought the sales figures to Martin Goodman, and he just wanted to keep pushing this. But it wasn't just the fact that these new colorful heroes were appearing in these these comic book magazines. I think what really captured the hearts and the imaginations of people reading these books at the time was the fact that these heroes were something that they had never seen before. These were new, complex heroes, heroes with problems. And I know that at this point, it's kind of a cliche to say that, but it's really true. Stan Lee did something at the time that was never done. He created these characters that were flawed. The Fantastic Four, they got all these amazing powers, but some of them didn't really want to be superheroes. They didn't want to have these amazing abilities. And I'm talking specifically about the Thing. And the team didn't always get along. Spider-Man, he's a teenager and he has these great powers. He can't tell anybody about his powers. And it seems that no matter what he does, he just can't have good luck. These bad things keep happening to him. And he has girl problems and he has rent problems. And people really enjoyed reading about this because I feel that these readers could identify more with these characters. Because let's face it, nobody lives a perfect life. Everybody wants to be able to find a character or somebody in fiction that they can identify with. And that is exactly what Stan Lee was providing for them. The other thing that was really interesting about what Stan Lee was doing at this time with all the books is that for the first time ever, all of these books appeared and seemed to take place in the same universe. So what was happening in one book, say Fantastic Four, something in Amazing Spider-Man actually would reference what happened in Fantastic Four. And now readers were suddenly discovering, hey, these characters exist in the same universe. Marvel caught on to that. They really did. So what they started doing was they started referencing other story elements and story plots that were happening in other magazines in a current magazine. So you knew what the Fantastic Four was doing by reading Spider-Man, and there would be these little asterisks and these little footnotes saying, hey, if you want to find out about this, check out a recent issue of Fantastic Four. And that would encourage people to go out and pick up this book. And this really was a great business strategy to have this more cohesive universe and have all these books kind of related to each other and to have this new brand of heroes. It was just really something. Now, of course, we can't really forget about DC during this era, because I think it's safe to say that Marvel was the more relevant of the big two during the 1960s. But DC also did quite well. They brought back a lot of their classic characters. And Batman, even towards the end of the 60s, got a little bit of a makeover because what happened was during the 60s, Batman actually was quite successful, and that was due in part to the Batman TV show. As a matter of fact, the 1960s, when it comes to that, 1960s pop culture is characterized by the 3 Bs, and those are Bond, Beatles, and Batman. So we can't underscore DC's success either, because of course they had Batman, and the sales of their Batman books were great, especially during that time. But unfortunately, what happened was once the show was canceled, well, then the sales of all the Batman books fell. See, I feel at the end of the day that DC really struggled to keep up with Marvel at this time. The books that they were publishing were good enough to keep the attention of readers, obviously, but they just didn't have that magic that the Marvel books had. Now, I'd like to hear from some of you because I have to say that when it comes to 1960s DC, that's a little bit of a weakness of mine. I don't know a lot about 1960s DC. Tell me about some interesting moments for DC Comics during the 1960s, because any of the stories that I read coming out of that company from the 1960s really didn't keep my attention. And this is coming from someone who absolutely loves Batman. Like, Batman is probably my all-time favorite superhero. But during this time, I really can't get through a Batman book without laughing. And let's see here. Eric Breen is saying, here's a tidbit for Dante. Julius Schwartz once offered Martin Goodman $15,000 for the rights to Cap, Torch, Submariner. Goodman refused. Good thing he did. I actually did not know that. That is a very interesting tidbit, actually. And I think this happened a few other times in history throughout the years. I'm not entirely sure. I didn't know about this one, but I heard something like Marvel was offered the rights to DC characters at some point when DC was not doing well. I don't know if it was in the late 1970s or 1980s. I don't know if that's true, but that is a huge rumor in the comic book collecting community. But that's amazing. And I think it's also worth noting at this point too that Marvel kind of followed that trend of bringing back classic heroes as well, because as I mentioned, DC was bringing back their classic heroes from the Golden Age, like the Flash and the Green Lantern, and Aquaman, and so on and so forth. So Marvel decided to do the exact same thing. They brought back one of their classic heroes, and that was Captain America. Captain America made his first Silver Age appearance in Avengers #4. And this was another superhero team, obviously, the Avengers, that became very popular. Captain America hadn't been in print probably since the 40s because, like every other superhero, he lost relevance after the war. And basically, they explained it as he was frozen in ice for so many years, and then he was brought back. And I think the Cap books at this time were very interesting because the Captain America that we got was still the Captain America from the 1940s. The world he left behind was from the 1940s, and he essentially became an anachronism. He didn't know what life was like in the 1960s, so he kind of became this like brooding character, almost like kind of like a Hamlet. And in each issue, he has like these extensive monologues about, oh, woe is me. I don't know how to live in this world. I don't know how to be relevant. And it's very interesting. It's very psychologically rich and pretty deep stuff for the 1960s, if you ask me. The Jono 95 is saying the Marvel comics felt fresh, but you could tell that the DC books in the 60s were written by middle-aged dudes. You never want it to be that obvious. Yeah, exactly. And at this point, Stan Lee became this. He was an older guy by this point. I think he was in his maybe 40s or something. So he was, for that time, 40 was considered quite old. No offense to any 40-year-olds here. I mean, I myself am in my 30s. I think if I were living 60 years ago, people would probably think I were old too. But so Stan Lee was in his 40s by this point, and he all of a sudden became this hip dude. I think the thing that Stan really understood was he really understood the national consciousness of the time. Now, we all know what happened in the 1960s, especially towards the late 1960s. We now have this culture of freedom and peace and free expression, and there were all these liberal messages that were circulating in mainstream American pop culture, and Stan Lee understood that. He included that in his books, and all of the Marvel books at the time kind of espoused these liberal ideas of the time. Marvel, they had diversity. Now, I understand that at the time, all these characters were, white and mostly male. But, Marvel did something a little differently. They would include characters of different ethnicities as cops, for example. Like you would see a black cop in a Marvel comic. Heck, even later on, like towards the end of the 60s, you started seeing superheroes from minority backgrounds. So we had Black Panther. Black Panther was probably considered to be the first black superhero to hit the pages, and he was awesome, and he basically broke all of the stereotypes that you saw for African Americans in mainstream comics at the time. It was just astounding. So that's something that DC really didn't catch on to until the later 1970s, when they started creating their own ethnic characters like Black Lightning. And yes, Jesse, perfect. They made Lois Lane black for an issue. If anybody, if anybody's actually read this issue, I don't remember the exact numbering, but this issue was Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane. Can't remember the numbering exactly. If you know the number, please let me know. But basically, what happens is Lois Lane wants to get a story in a part of town called Little Africa. I know it's kind of funny, talking about it so many years later. But she needs to get this story in Little Africa, and she thinks that the only way she can do it is by becoming a black woman for a day. So she gets into this machine. She becomes a black woman, and she basically sees how your average black woman is treated on a day-to-day basis, and all of the stereotypes you can think of are pretty much covered in this book. Like, there's this one scene where she's trying to hail a cab and she can't because no one will stop for her because she's black. And many many people who are from the African American community that I've spoken to about this book think it's pretty cringeworthy. But at the same time, they think that it was a valiant effort by DC at the time, because these were primarily white guys that were writing these books, and they did the best that they could to kind of diffuse this message of inclusiveness. And yes, that is Lois Lane, number 106. And also Warlord, YouTube user Warlord is saying hello, and welcome to the stream. Lowell Lucas Jr. is saying, back then DC wasn't comfortable with minorities and would quickly change the character to white. It took Marvel to convince them it was time. Black Lightning had some issues. Sorry, my camera's in my way there. DC was really slow. I think they just didn't really know how to handle it. But Marvel handled it effectively in the 1960s, and they just did a great job with it. I think the other thing that was funny too about that Lois Lane number 106 issue is I think towards the end of the comic, Lois Lane's talking to Superman, and she says, like, you really don't know what these people are going through, and it's very difficult. And then she asks him this question: would you still marry me if I were black forever? And the thing that I find interesting is that Superman never actually answers the question. He just kind of hems and haws, and he's like, well, how could you ask me that? I come from another planet, and blah, 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 hems and haws, and bam, she turns white again before he even has to answer the question. So I found that to be quite comical. But again, different time, different book, and that was DC's attempt at the time. But Marvel just continued to give us these characters from diverse backgrounds into the early 1970s. Even I think the 1970s was probably a little better for this explosion of characters from diverse backgrounds, because in the 60s I think they kind of toyed with it a little bit. They experimented to see what would happen, and it ended up being quite popular in the 60s. So they decided to bring more diverse characters to the Marvel scene in the 1970s. It looks like I actually am going to have time to start the Bronze Age, because I don't really know if there's any more to say about the Silver Age. Is there anything else you want me to talk about with respect to the Silver Age? Let me know in these comments right now, because I feel like I should be saying more about the Silver Age right now. But then again, the Golden Age lasted longer than the Silver Age did, so that probably explains why I'm 30 minutes into the show and feel like I'm already done the Silver Age. Marvel gave us. Oh yeah, that's actually another important highlight from the Silver Age, from the 1960s especially, is the Silver Surfer. And the Silver Surfer, if there was like a poster boy for 1960s counterculture, it probably was the Silver Surfer. You have to read the Silver Surfer if you haven't. I think it's probably, in my opinion, one of the more underrated series coming out of the Silver Age. But if you read it, he's great. He's almost like this cosmic philosopher. He's from another planet. His name is Norrin Rad. And obviously he was working for Galactus, and now he's separated from Galactus. That all happens in Fantastic Four. But he gets his own title, and now he's on Earth. And he just can't understand why he can't understand human nature. He can't understand why human beings are so are so prone to war. They fear what they don't understand. Like the Silver Surfer himself gets a lot of hate for looking different himself, and he's always brooding and talking about these different ideas that I really think got people thinking at the time. And that's why I think Marvel was so important during this time, because I think they really helped to bolster this 1960s counterculture. If superheroes in the Golden Age really helped to bolster the war effort and morale during the war, I really think that superheroes, especially the Marvel heroes at this time, really kind of bolster that 60s counterculture that preached a lot of this inclusivity and all these liberal ideas. Now, Marvel actually jumped right into this 60s culture at one point, because pop art became very popular in the 60s for a bit. They actually changed in all their books, they had this little picture that said Pop Art Productions. So they were really kind of pushing the pop art at this time, and it was just it sold well. Then they brought in Jim Steranko, who was an artist that really brought in a lot of that 60s style art. He had like a lot of psychedelic type images. Like I think Steranko's stuff at the time was probably the most interesting. His work on Nick Fury, Agent of Shield, just great. Yeah, and I'm just gonna take a look at this. Women in the 60s were more than secretaries, or was that more in the Bronze Age? Yeah, I'm gonna have to say that's a little bit more Bronze Age. Yeah, because you got to think all of these Marvel heroes debuted in the 1960s, and they were primarily men, with the exception of obviously Sue Storm. But then you get all these like women's movements towards the end of the 1960s that are preaching, equal rights and all these ideas of feminism, and that's when Marvel in the early 1970s and going in towards the mid 70s and the end of the 70s started bringing in more of these female characters. Like you have Spider-Woman, She-Hulk. I don't think it was until 1980, but She-Hulk was a character. Then many of the X-Men were women. You had Jean Grey made her appearance in the 60s, but Storm became a fan favorite. And Storm was not only a woman, but she's a black woman, which made it even more incredible. So I think that was more the 70s, and we definitely we'll talk about that as we transition to the 1970s. I'm just going to take a quick sip of water here, if you don't mind. So before we move on to the Bronze Age, I just wanted to say DC Comics dabbled in this 60s culture as well, but it was a little different in the way that they did it. I think they were kind of just skimming the surface. of 60s culture in their books. They weren't really getting to the heart of where this culture was coming from. For example, DC tried to be trendy by putting the black and white checkerboard at the top of all of their books. They had their characters doing these like weird stereotypical 60s things. I'm thinking particularly of the Adam West TV show. It had him doing these the dance with the 60s girls, the typical 60s girls, and doing the Batusi or whatever that is. And I have a feeling that now that I did that, there's going to be a meme of me tomorrow doing this. But yeah, and again, I think that was just more superficial. They were just kind of skimming the surface, and I think they missed the point of where the 60s culture was coming from. So, excuse me, I think hope I'm not getting sick here. I think I'm just talking too much. Oh, I actually didn't know this. Believe it or not, the man who created Storm and Nightcrawler wanted them for DC, but got rejected. Marie Callender, it's COVID. I don't think so. I'm actually a healthcare worker, and I get swabbed for COVID quite frequently, and I haven't had it yet, and I'm hoping I don't get it. But yeah, actually, I didn't know this. I didn't know that Storm and Nightcrawler got rejected for DC. Again, it was probably because they were diverse. I don't know. Kurt Wagner is German. Wolverine's Canadian. And yeah, how can I forget the shark repellent, the Batman? It was just so funny. Like in that show, the 60s Batman is not my favorite interpretation of Batman. But I always laugh that he always has the right thing at the right time. And that bat shark repellent, I laughed when I saw that. Actually, they poked fun at it a little bit in the Lego Batman movie. If you've seen that, it was actually really good. If you've seen the Lego Batman movie. Yeah, let's see here. Oh, this is all you guys just having your own conversation, right? And that's fine. Please have your own conversation. Yeah, and we're gonna get to talking about this the drug story from 97 to 99. I think it's also worth mentioning too that throughout in the 1960s, DC, it was actually more towards the end of the 60s that DC started bringing in this new blood. They were like, you know what, if we're going to stay relevant as a comic book company, or we want to, if we even want to get close to what Marvel's doing right now, we got to bring in some fresh blood. So that's exactly what they did. And DC started bringing in these new talents that were really immersed in the 60s culture. We have Denny O'Neil, we had Neil Adams. And Denny O'Neil, if you don't know much about him, he actually, he calls himself, rest his soul, he passed away actually not too long ago, but he always would say that he was a hippie. During the 1960s, he was a hippie. Like he studied journalism. He wanted to change the world through his writing. And, he said he read comic books, but he was just kind of moving around. He was a little bit of a nomad, and he eventually landed this job at DC. And he didn't think he was going to be at DC for very long, but he ended up staying there for, heck, I don't know, 50 years or something like that. But yeah, so DC's bringing in all this new blood, and they're starting to shake it up and make DC more relevant. And DC became a little bit more relevant in the 1970s, but I really think that in the Bronze Age, Marvel still was on top. You really could not touch Marvel in the Bronze Age. DC came close, but it was very tough with DC. And actually, Wesley Stewart, who was a guest, welcome Wesley, who was a guest on our show last week. We were actually talking about how the 1970s probably should go to Marvel with respect to who was more significant out of the big two. Yeah. So you have these. I think it's worth mentioning too that we have Denny O'Neil, who made Wonder Woman, took away her powers, and made her a spy for a little bit. and that got a lot of backlash from the feminist community. Gloria Steinem actually wrote an article saying that Wonder Woman was the only woman who had powers, and you basically took them away. You took power away from women, and he basically was like, I understand, sorry, and Wonder Woman got her powers back. Lowell Lucas Jr. has a question for me. What's my favorite Silver Age story? Great question. I'm probably, if I think about it, I'm probably okay. So it's definitely Amazing Spider-Man, because my favorite Marvel hero is the Amazing Spider-Man, the Spider-Man, obviously. Probably would have to say the Amazing Spider-Man number, either Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of Spider-Man, because I thought that was great. That Spider-Man didn't even start off as a hero. He went into show business, right? And it was only after his uncle died that he decided to become a hero. But my other one, I probably would have to be Amazing Spider-Man. I think it was number 6, which is the first appearance of Kirk Connors and the Lizard. The Lizard's actually one of my favorite Marvel villains. Believe it or not. I know most people love Green Goblin or Magneto or something. The Lizard is actually my favorite, and I love that first appearance. Great story. So probably would have to say those two there. Yeah. Okay. So moving on. Sorry, I'm just reading here. Okay. Moving on. Actually have a question for all the viewers here tonight. When would you say the Silver Age ended? Because this is a heavily contested question. When the Silver Age ended, I can tell you when I think the Silver Age ended, but when I think the Silver Age ended, is probably not when you thought it did. And I'll give you guys a second. I'm just gonna look at some of these comments here. Love the Lizard. Was Gwen Stacy death Silver Age, by the way? And that relates to my question, to the question that I just asked, actually. So I will tell you about that in a second. Yes, I do love Killer Croc. I actually have the first appearance of Killer Croc that I'm still waiting to read, and great character. I love Killer Croc. He was awesome in the Batman Arkham games. So great, especially that boss battle in Arkham Origins where you have Croc snapping at you. I thought that was great. Okay, so here we go. Some people are answering my question about when they think Silver Age ended. So I'm going to post a few of them here. So we have Eric Breen saying, death of Gwen Stacy, as far as I'm concerned. With Marvel Monsters, Silver Age ended. I was told the Silver Age ended when Gwen Stacy died because comics lost their innocence. And Adrian Bedingfield is saying, I think the Silver Age ended when comic companies started doing more adult stories. I actually agree. All of you that said the death of Gwen Stacy as the end of the Silver Age, that is what I'm saying. That's when I believe the Silver Age ended. Some comic historians who I think about this way too much, to be honest, but they say that this is actually way too late for the Silver Age to end. I've heard actually that some people saying that the Silver Age ended when Jack Kirby left Marvel to go to DC. That was another one, but I think us fans need something concrete, like a clear ending point. And to me, that clear ending point is the death of Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man number 121. If you haven't read that story, you need to. Probably one of the most famous Spider-Man stories ever. Green Goblin throws Gwen Stacy off of I think it was the George Washington Bridge. Spider-Man shoots his line to save her. He catches her, but you see this little snap, and Gwen Stacy died by her, basically by from her neck snapping. And the reason why a lot of people unofficially would call this the end of the Silver Age is because this marked that transition to these darker stories. Previously, in comic books, people didn't really die. Relevant characters didn't really die. I mean, yeah, you had Uncle Ben who died, but reoccurring characters that were an integral part of supporting casts in comic books never died. And certainly never died in the manner that Gwen Stacy did. But she actually stayed dead. And people were like, people couldn't believe it. They lost their minds when Gwen Stacy died. Some people that were reading Amazing Spider-Man 121 at this time actually compared this when they were kids as they were calling it their Kennedy assassination moment. They were just in shock that they would actually do that. Let's see here. Wesley saying that the Bronze Age reigned from 1970 to 1983. Yeah, I think in terms of years, that would probably be the most logical way to categorize, the Bronze Age. But like, I think people are looking. Some people look for like an issue that kind of shows it. Just like that the official start of the Silver Age was Showcase number 4. I think what people want is that issue. In terms of years, yes, I think 1970 and 1983 definitely would be good years. But I think in terms of an issue, I think the only issue that really stands out has to be that Amazing Spider-Man 121 from 1973. So I don't know. And again, I don't think there's ever going to be a right or wrong answer for this because there is no one agreed upon event or moment that defines the beginning of the Bronze Age. Adrian Benningfield is asking, did the Joker get revived during the time Gwen died? I think that was the same year, actually. I don't think the Joker ever really went anywhere. I think what happened with the Joker was Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil in Batman 251, they published a story, and it's actually a key issue from the Bronze Age. It's a famous cover, Neil Adams cover with Joker holding Batman, who's like plastered to a playing card. That's the story in which the Joker is kind of portrayed as a more like a villainous, maniacal type character, because during the 50s and the 60s, he kind of got silly, kind of akin more to the Joker you would see from the 1960s Batman TV show. But it was in that Batman 251 that we see the Joker as a maniac. You see him as the Joker essentially that we know today. So not the first modern appearance of the Joker, but I think it's the first modern appearance of the psychotic Joker that we know today for sure. And basically everything I just said is summed up by Joker's rebirth back into a killer. Yeah, essentially that's what it is. So for sure. So Bronze Age now, this is actually my favorite period in comic books. Totally my favorite period in comic books. My collection is mostly Bronze Age books, and I think the reason why I like this era, I think you really kind of have a little bit of a Wild West going on in the comic book industry. So this is a time in which the comics code actually gets laxed quite a bit. And this didn't happen until the mid-1970s, almost the mid-1970s with that, I don't know, was it the early 1970s? It started getting lax with first the Amazing Spider-Man drug story that Stan Lee did. It was 97 to 90, or 96 to 98 or something like that. Someone posted it up here. I can't find the comment at this time, but yeah, I think it was like 96 to 98, something like that. Basically, it's someone sent Stan Lee a letter basically saying, hey, can you do, because drugs were a huge problem at the time. They were a silent killer, huge problem that was a vestige from 1960s culture, and drugs continued to proliferate in the 1970s. So someone sent Stan Lee a letter and said, hey, can you do a story talking about the dangers of drugs? Does a story about this one kid that Spider-Man saves that is really high. Harry's also, Harry Osborn ends up being a junkie as well in this book. And he sends it away to the Code to get the approval, and they say, no, we're not publishing it. You're not going to get the Code seal approval because you can't have drugs in a story. And he's like, I'm not telling people to take drugs. I'm just showing the dangers of drugs. Why can't I get the? He's like, nope, can't have drugs. So Stan Lee's like, screw you. I'm just gonna publish the book without the seal of approval. And he did, and the book ended up being super, super popular. And yes, it was 96 to 98. Thank you, John 095. Yeah, they were huge, these books. And actually, the late Stan Lee even says of all the books that he ever did in his life that he's most proud of Amazing Spider-Man 96 to 98. Then, not too long after this book was released, DC did an even darker story that Wesley Stewart mentioned a little while back, and which ran in Green Lantern, Green Arrow, wherein Speedy, Green Arrow's ward, Speedy, becomes a junkie, and this was a very dark story that showed the dangers of heroin. Yeah, really, really dark story, and it actually it got a lot of attention. The mayor of New York at the time wrote a letter in one of the comics saying that this is such an important issue. I think everyone should read it, so on and so forth. So yeah, these issues here about drugs is what kind of got the Code to relax a bit, because the Comics Code started saying, okay, well, I guess we can start publishing drug stories. And then not too long after, they said, okay, maybe we could start publishing stories about vampires. Okay, fine, maybe we could start publishing books about werewolves. So you almost had kind of like a renaissance happen in the Bronze Age, because all of these genres that previously were popular in other times and up until that point became obsolete because of censorship, started making their way back into comic book culture. So you started seeing Marvel horror, and I always talk about Marvel horror. Love Marvel horror. Marvel did this great horror books in the Bronze Age, and I really love what Marvel did with horror during this time, because I found that they treaded this line between horror book and superhero book perfectly. So you have these characters coming out like Morbius. Morbius is part kind of like villain, hero, anti-hero, whatever, part horror character. Werewolf, same thing. Werewolf by Night. It reads like a horror book, but it also kind of reads like a superhero book at times too. Tomb of Dracula, same thing. Like, and DC, actually, I don't want to undersell DC, because DC had some great horror stuff at this time too. Now, Swamp Thing made his first appearance. Was it in the early 70s? I know it was like what was it? House of Shadows, or you're gonna have to remind me. First appearance of Swamp Thing again. House of Secrets. House of Secrets, 92. Okay, I'm lost with that book right now, but so you're gonna have to tell me. But I think it was in the 60s. So, but yeah, DC had these great horror books as well. So now you got these horrors that are yes, it is House of Secrets 92. Thank you, Jono. Yeah, so you have all these books from other genres that are now front and center again. Horror, westerns. Marvel even had this book. It didn't last very long. It's kind of a niche book, and I really wanted to add it to my collection. It's actually called Night Nurse, and it's about a nurse who like takes care of all these superheroes after they've been injured. I thought the concept was actually really interesting. I think it only ran like 7 issues or something, but and then also we have sword and sorcery is another genre that becomes popular at this time. You have Conan the Barbarian. You have Khazar. Khazar's not sword and sorcery. He's more like a jungle type comic. But yeah, you had Conan. You had Kull the Conqueror was the other guy I was thinking of. yeah, like there were just so many different genres. If you see a roster of all the books that were published at this time, it's just amazing. And then you have these anthology books that are still being published, like like Marvel 2-in-1 and like Marvel team ups type of thing. Like there was just so many exciting things going on during this era. You have all these new characters that are appearing, all these diverse characters. Yes, Red Sonja too. She made her appearance too in Sword and Sorcery. um, sorry. Yes, Night Nurse. Oh, it only lasted 4 issues. My apologies. And you need a second mortgage just to get them in mint. Yeah, I know they're like super expensive. Eric, can you tell me why they're super expensive? Is it just because they're um, is it just because that they're rare, or is there something else about them? Like I said, they're really a niche book. You don't really when people think collecting comics, they don't think Night Nurse, right? So, uh, but yeah, so you just all these different characters now from diverse backgrounds are appearing. You have Wolverine, he's white, but he's Canadian. You have Storm, who makes her appearance, who's a black woman. Kurt Wagner, he's German. Well, Colossus, he's Russian. Marvel really tackled this diversity issue head on, and I think they were spot on with how they dealt with the issues of diversity in their books at the time, because they weren't really these messages weren't thrown in your face as much as they are in some books today. They were really subtle about it, and people love them. They just went nuts for these books, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, now we start seeing women go from like secretaries and love interests of superheroes to now becoming heroes themselves, like Spider-Woman. You have whatever, Power Girl, Miss Marvel. Now, unfortunately, some of the stereotypes about women you still saw kind of illustrated in comics at this time, but definitely what you saw here is progress. You saw this move and this kind of liberation of women happen in the 1970s. It was just super interesting. Yeah, and you cannot forget actually Luke Cage and Shang-Chi. Luke Cage is I think you would probably consider him the second black superhero. And actually, I would have to say that to this day, Luke Cage, Hero for Hire #1 is probably my second favorite Bronze Age book. I have it in my collection, and it's one of my holy grail books, just because I love Power Man. I love Luke Cage. Just such a great series. That early series, actually, it was really sad that they had to have him team up with Iron Fist later on, just because the book wasn't popular enough to sustain itself. But I really enjoyed it. So yeah. And let's see here. Yeah, Thunderbird was Native American for sure. And then DC released Black Lightning. So just so many different characters, and such an exciting time. And as we're nearing towards the end of the show, I just want to leave a couple minutes just for questions. If you have any questions or any closing remarks or closing comments or anything, I would love to hear them. We're going to continue this series next week. We are going to tackle the 1980s, and if we have time, also the 1990s in our episode next week. So you definitely do not want to miss that, because it definitely will be a good one. Because the 1980s, for those of you that were around, the 1980s and the 1990s were some really crazy times in comic books. A lot of interesting stuff going on, and of course, we'll recap the Bronze Age and talk a little bit about the Bronze Age a little bit more as well. So, yes, good God. What was it here? Good God, Night Nurse #1 is going for $300. Ouch. Yes. Really crazy. Yes, Image and Chrome, Wesley. The Chrome that you love so much. Wesley and I both love holographic covers. I think they're great. So just wanted to thank you all so much for joining me here this evening. Had a great time talking about the Silver Age and the Bronze Age with you. I hope you will all tune in next week when we will talk about the 1980s and possibly the 1990s, and of course, recap the Bronze Age. Also, thank you to everyone who watched the new video that was posted just a few days ago about the 90s being the future of comic book collecting. And stay tuned next week for our video next week. It's actually going to be, I think, a Star Wars related video. I'm also a huge Star Wars fan, so we're going to start doing some Star Wars related videos as well. Want to keep up the geek culture in its entirety for sure. Thank you all again so much for tuning in. And it's Friday. Let's go out. Let's have some fun. And I will see you all in the next episode. Have a great night, and we will see you next week. Take care.